With the other buffs to the German tech tree line in World of Tanks console, we saw some pretty substantial ones and maybe even a little bit too far in my previous video, but today's video is going to focus on the top tier, the tier 10, the E100, and we're going to see whether the buffs to this, which include both a reload buff on the 15cm along with a massive turret buff to the cheeks of the tank, whether or not it has really done that much to the tank itself, and whether or not you're going to be seeing this tank dominate in the battlefield. And I guess that's what the core kind of questions are within this video. Of course, if you've played either of them or any of the German heavy tanks within the tech tree that have been buffed recently, then make sure to leave those in the comment section down below, your opinions on those. But what you can see me doing here, we're playing Pilsen, probably one of the better maps for if you're deciding to play the German heavy tanks, and especially if you're trying to play the E100, probably the best side-scraping heavy tank, at least for the most part, when you're playing at Pilsen, because you just have the opportunity to get into some really nice positions that you can side-scrape off of the buildings, and you're always up close and personal, where you can use the top tier gun on this thing, 750 alpha damage, obviously heat 100 here. We've got to load it if we want to make sure that we're penning and making sure that we are consistently dealing the damage, because the reload on this thing is fairly substantial. You're looking at about 14 seconds off the top of my head, and that is really not particularly too great for the most part. What you'll see here, obviously the 113 just tried to snap a shot and we can plow one straight into the side of him. There's no real problem. And now this is what you're seeing. The armor model of the E100, of course, it is just purely thick armor. There is basically nothing else to the tank other than the fact it has this chunky armor and it is completely flat, which allows you to make plays like this. You're seeing us really over angle the lower plate here, but because he can't get any of the side of our tank, he's not going to be able to pen unless he gets super lucky and hits in the kind of triangle that comes next to the track, so there's always that. Now what you see us just snap on the Object 268 version 5, do take a hit in return, but he doesn't manage to pen, so it's all fine. You see us quickly turn the turret armor there, which allows us to block the shot from the 113. We're going to stop, we're going to aim a little bit, and we're going to plow one right into the lower plate of the 113 there, picking up another little bit of damage within the game. Now, we're not going to stop there. Obviously, we are in a heavy tank that relies on just making sure that every time you're reloading, you're putting out damage, because if you don't have great DPM, and so you're going to often find yourself in a little bit of a disadvantage if you don't manage to get that damage out quickly. But luckily, although unluckily at the same time, we only track the Waffenträger Alpha 100, which has made it kind of a little bit disappointing, since we only managed to get assistance damage rather than damage as well, and that's something you definitely don't want to be doing in the E100, and you'll notice that with the heat rounds of the E100, because they are heat rounds, if they get anywhere near any sort of track, you're going to be bouncing, or they're going to get absorbed into the tracks, which means you won't do any damage, whereas maybe an AP round would have been able to go straight through the tracks and also deal damage at the same time. Unfortunately doesn't happen, but because we load in the heat rounds against the E100, we managed to put one nicely into him. You see us angling the turret here, just make it a little bit more difficult for the E100 to place around into us, and if he does manage to, it doesn't really matter too much. We're now going to try and go after the IS-4, unfortunately hits that track, which we talked about. And this is the real problem with the E100. I thought maybe, just maybe, this tank would be really good within the game now, considering the turret armor got that buff, which allows it to be just a little bit better. But unfortunately, that's just not the case. Even with the turret buff that this thing gets, you can still get penned through the mantler of the tank, which definitely doesn't help whatsoever. You'll see us actually aiming at the enemy E100 here, even with the turret buff. With the heat rounds of the E100 against an E100, you can pen it nearly every single time and every single day of the week. And that is kind of where the problem lies with the E100, is that the flat kind of armor of it means that although it's relying on that heavy armor, it doesn't actually end up doing too much to the tank itself. So obviously make sure that if you are going to go towards E100, you understand that the armor model probably isn't going to work in an all-out engagement one-on-one against the opponents that you're likely to be facing, but it definitely will help you out in some scenarios, and I guess that's something you'll have to kind of decide whether you want to be an aggressive kind of heavy tank or whether you want to play something like this, which can kind of poke away and chip away 750 hit points from all of the opponents that you'll be firing at. Obviously picking up the last kill on that Leopard and an E100 behind us, which we're never going to be able to reload before the game ends and our teammates manage to pick him up. So a very okay game slash one of the better games that I've had in the E100 lately, which means that it kind of skews my opinion of the tank. 5,600 damage, 1750 base XP, not too bad, 3708 assistance, totaling 9300 combined damage, which is a pretty good game for the E100. You don't tend to get too much assistance with this pretty heavy hitter, but it definitely showcases, you know, in those games where you're feeling like you are confident when you're on a town map, that's for sure. Unfortunately, there aren't too many of those in current rotation on World of Tanks console. Means that you can be pretty nice, you can be pretty strong in some scenarios, and the turret buff definitely helps a little bit, but the armor model overall just doesn't really help you out too much in the grand scheme of things. Taking a quick look at another map on the game, obviously Arctic region, another gameplay. It's a fairly quick gameplay. We'll have one more after this to kind of showcase a tank a little bit more, but this definitely features the main problems about the E100, because there are quite a few, but it also showcases when the tank is really, really good. And I guess that this tank really, for me, is so situational. And the speed of the tank really does limit it from being able to really have those games where you're feeling like you're impacting the game enough. And does the increase in armor that over something like a medium tank that can mobilize itself all over the map throughout the game, does it really warrant it? And is the armor that good? Well, probably not, in my personal opinion. I think that you'd be better off if you know the game, if you're a bit more versed in the game, playing something that maybe isn't quite like the E100 and allows you to kind of move around the map and use your knowledge of the game to just do better. Because I found that often if you commit to a flank, which you know is pretty much the only good flank in the game in the E100 for you to go, and then your team just don't go there, either you go the other way and then end up having a terrible game because it's just not a flank that's particularly good for your tank, or alternatively you try and hold off one entire flank against yourself or by yourself, and it doesn't work out either. So it's like I don't know, it just depends on the team matchup, and I don't like tanks that rely on your teammates too much, because often they let you down and then you end up having a terrible game. Or maybe it's not just purely because of your team, it's just because the situation didn't arise that allowed you to have that fantastic game. However, in this matchup we are going to be able to have a pretty decent game, albeit to begin with, and I guess that is where the crux of the issue comes in after this little fight here. Obviously it's a pretty stiff competition here. We've got like, what, 6 tanks in front of us, and it's the majority of the enemy team actually, which means that we've got a little bit of thinking to do. What are we going to actually prioritise? Who are we going to get first? We're obviously shooting the Object 705, get him out of the game because he can pummel us, and then we're going to be getting hit from the right hand side by all of these other heavies and mediums that are going to poke us every time we fire against the 705 if he manages to get hold down. Luckily we bounce around, and this is something that you probably aren't too used to in the E100 bouncing rounds, but definitely since the turret buff happened, it does allow you to bounce a few more. Is it substantially enough to make it like super overpowered? Definitely not. The E100 is not an overpowered tank by all means, within console at least. So I think that, yeah, for those of you wondering if the E100 has the same level buffs as maybe something like the Tiger 2 did, yeah, it's just not the case. However, you know, when you're coming up against the other German tier 10 heavy, the Panzer KPFW 7 there, I think the E100 has it every single day of the week. The weak points on the Panzer KPFW7, when you actually know them, nullify the armour model completely, and even if you're the best player in the world, you often will just get penned regardless, whereas the E100, if you do play right and you angle, you can still have really, really good games. And you can see we've just demolished this entire flank against the opponents that we've got here. I'm now going to try and get rid of this M48 pattern. We do make a little bit of a misplay by losing a load of health to him, but yeah, a very easy kind of flat terrain battle where we're kind of just using the tank and using the ability to bounce a few rounds whilst also dishing out that 750 to make it really easy. And talking about the downfall of the game and the downfall of the tank, this showcases probably the biggest downfall of the E100, and that is flat terrain against artillery, losing what, more than half of our hit points within like 10 seconds of being out in the open. Yeah, that happens all of the time within the game, and yeah, that's our game ruined within a matter of seconds. But we won't dwell on it too much. Let's jump into another gameplay where maybe this doesn't happen. We can showcase a tank for the whole game. The final gameplay for today's video, we're looking at Muravanka, and this is a map that I guess could potentially, like the previous one, lead to some disasters with artillery, but luckily for us there are no artillery on the enemy team, which allow us to at least be a little bit less worried about the fact that we're going to lose like 3/4 of our hit points to artillery in a game, or even just have to play arty safe within the game, because that can often ruin your game if an artillery decides to focus you, which, trust me, artillery, once they've chosen the target for some reason, even though it's not worth it for them, will just continually focus. And yeah, that definitely happens within the game. Now there's an AMX-13-105 that's decided that apparently he's gonna just go straight through the middle of the map against everyone, which is never a good idea, and he's going to pay the full price for it. We are using the small gun here, so we are using the ultimate, well, the highest DPM version of the E100 here, but I found using this gun, although it can be better in some scenarios where you can keep the gun singing, often because of the mobility of the E100, you can't actually get into a position where you are quick enough and then use the DPM of the tank for long enough to actually warrant just not using the high alpha 750 gun that the tank gets over this 490 alpha damage gun that you're seeing here. Obviously, I think what we have to take into account with this E100 and the fact that it has got turret buffs makes it kind of, does it outweigh the Maus now? Is it just better than the Maus? Well, I think it kind of comes down to whether you want to be super slow or whether you want to be just slow and have the opportunity to get penned in the turret, at least fairly easily without much accuracy. You know, you can pen the Maus turret very easily, but whether or not you can pen it reliably all of the time is a different matter, because yeah, it's a smaller target to hit those kind of rounded edges, which I guess is something that you have to know when you're playing either of them two tanks. And if you've played either of them, let me know what you think. Would you rather play the E100 or would you rather play the Maus? I don't really know personally which one will be better within the game, but I think it's one to another, two to the other. You know, they're pretty much like the exact same in terms of the way they play. One's just slightly slower, and hence why I'd probably rather play the E100, because even if the Maus does actually bounce a few more rounds, because you're so slow, that's usually the limiting factor, and you'll see that within the meta currently within World of Tanks. So although this tank has been buffed, I really don't think it is too much to worry about compared to some of the other tanks within the game, and I guess that is really where I'd 100% rather see this tank over any of the medium tanks on the enemy team, because you just don't have the DPM in this to make it really that threatening, and the armor model isn't that bad to mean that you have to worry about actually penning this thing when you do see it eventually. What you're seeing here is just loading APCR, because don't want to bounce anymore, and it's coming to the close of the game. It's 10-6, and it's one of those typical games where you end up losing within like 3 minutes of the game. which seems to be happening more and more within console. I don't know whether that's because people for some reason think that the, the light tank YOLO in the French wheeled vehicles somehow works in all of the tanks in the game. Yeah, I don't quite know what's going on there, but yeah, we'll pick up 2,800 damage so far, and there is a little bit more to be had within this game. But what I thought that this gameplay showed you is that, yeah, you can play the DPM role within the E100 that you're seeing here. And it definitely does help when you're playing in these sort of scenarios where there's lots of opponents to shoot, and every time you reload you're going to be able to shoot someone. And when you're loading the HE against something like a machine, it's even more fun when you set them on fire as well. So yeah, I think it's definitely difficult, and it's definitely an interesting tank. Is it going to be one of those that's certainly breaking the game? Absolutely not. You can see just how easily you get penned even from the front from a lot of the opponents that you're coming up against, and unfortunately we only picked up 4,684 damage there, but it showcased, you know, you can rack it up pretty quickly. It doesn't take a genius to really work out how to use this tank. Make sure that you're angling, and usually just make sure that you're angling to the majority of the opponents. Don't just try and turn around to like one tank when there's 5 of them sat in front of you. It's not worth turning around because you'll get penned from all directions regardless of what you're doing. So there we go. Hopefully a little short rundown of probably a very disappointing tank within World of Tanks, and certainly one I wouldn't really recommend within the game, or at least within the current meta of World of Tanks and with the current map rotation that's in World of Tanks console, because we're missing a lot of the town maps within the game. Ruinberg, Erlenberg, Ensk, all of the kind of maps that really you can use this sort of tank on. So yeah, definitely one to kind of avoid, or at least kind of put on the back burner whilst you're grinding through some other tech tree lines. But there we go. Hopefully you did enjoy this video. If you did, make sure to like the video, and of course check out some of the other videos, especially the Tiger 2 video and review that we did recently that really is amazing, and this is on the lead up to the E100, so definitely enjoyable and useful to know. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you join me in the next one, and I'll see you there. Goodbye.